Thank you for coming. My name is Peter Cohen, and I've been pretty involved in UrbanIDEA, and just want to do a very quick intro and thank you, and then turn it over to our moderator for the evening, Mario Yedidia. Just a few thank yous before we get started. There's some folks who've been involved in this whole enterprise of creating this progressive think tank, as we think of it, UrbanIDEA, you know, kind of still on a shoestring, but really want to create a space where we can talk more deeply about some very big policy issues with a kind of progressive left perspective. And so that's our intention. My colleague Fernando Marti, Mario Yedidia himself, Rachel Verhinsky, who's at USF, Carl Beitel, who I'm not sure is here tonight, Andrew Wood from the arts community, Calvin Welch, SFIC, and others. We're trying to make this something that will have a lasting presence in San Francisco, doing forums like this, potentially doing some research work, engaging with smart students and folks in the academia. So that's our effort. So thanks to all those folks who volunteered. Also to, you saw our volunteer staff out at the front, folks who have come here tonight mostly to help out students and just volunteer. So it's great to have people who are committing an evening to helping out. I want to give them recognition. And then lastly, LGBT Center. I don't know if Kat is here or Mike, but they've been very generous about letting us use this space for a very generous price. So we appreciate that. I think it's because they really dig the material, but it's a nice space. So thank you for LGBT Center. And then, of course, the panelists, which Mario will go into more detail. Do want to tell you that we've started now our 2014 series of panels. We were in an experimental stage last year. We did a panel in June on the regional planning process of Plan Bay Area. Very good program, well attended. Tim Redmond, in fact, was the moderator for that program. We did another panel in November around this big issue of supply and demand of housing in San Francisco. Again, it was great. We had it was more of a debate format, and Fernando Marti was our moderator. So we worked out the kinks, and this year we have a series of forums, this being the first. Our second will be on Wednesday, May 14th, so mark your calendars. It's going to be on the transportation equity topic. Really the question of when you put major investments in transportation improvements, as is being planned for San Francisco and the region, who pays and who benefits? And that's both a technical question and it's a political question. We're going to have some really sharp folks to kind of unpack that question for you. It's something I think we should all be tuning into. And then we're going to have our third forum of this year on October 1st, which is in election season. And it's probably not going to be, your typical kind of what's on the ballot discussion, but really a discussion about the political landscape at this point in time and what it looks like ahead. Again, we want to have, tons more political analysis of what is happening in San Francisco and the region, and we'll have some really good people there. So hopefully you can attend all of those, and we'll be sending out announcements. And then lastly, just a very modest plug that if you like the program tonight and you like what we're trying to do with UrbanIDEA and you're feeling a little generous, we'd love you to make a small donation. We're at this point just kind of operating on fumes. So if you want to drop a little donation in the jar at the door.
Or a really big donation.
Oh yeah. Calvin's less modest than I am.
That's right.
Fives or 5-0s or 5-0-0s. So I want to turn it over to Mario Yedidia. Where'd Mario go? Mario, please. Mario with SF Rising, he can tell a little bit more about himself, but we asked him to moderate tonight, and we're going to turn over the rest of the evening to Mario and our panel. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening. Good evening, Mario.
How you guys doing?
Very well.
Good. Thanks so much, Peter. Reiterate the thanks to all the labor that was put into putting tonight on, and thanks to all of you, really sincerely, for coming out tonight. My name is Mario Yedidia, and I coordinate San Francisco Rising. We're an alliance of 9 community-based organizations rooted in San Francisco's working class communities of color. and our aim is to build the political power of our communities. This evening, we are lucky to have assembled a pretty singular set of practitioners, thinkers, an elected official, for a conversation we've called 3 Decades Against Displacement, from Prop M to the Housing Balance. There's a host of assumptions embedded in that title, and as your moderator, I'd like to take just a few moments to unpack them and ground our discussion in some history and some data. It's a cliche that San Francisco, both at its roots and constitutively, is a city of booms and busts. Intense periods of high volume accumulation, coupled with attendant disruptions, dislocations, and the displacement of human beings. And in turn, subsequent periods of fallow after the fall, which in turn result in another period of accumulation, and so the cycle goes on and on, right? So indeed, real quick, the history. Accumulation was the name of the game when in the 18th century, the Spanish Empire made its way into Alta California in order to improve its position vis-a-vis British and Russian fur traders, right? And we are all familiar with the rush that followed the discovery of gold in January of 1848 at Sutter's Mill. A period during which the great majority of the 50,000 indigenous peoples then remaining in California were exterminated, including in, of course, what Mary Jean Robertson has called occupied Ohlone territory, San Francisco. Fast forward to the modern era with the winding down of the Second World War, and the region's ruling corporate elite organized itself as the Bay Area Council, 6 of whose charter members, Bank of America, American Trust Company, Standard Oil, PG&E, U.S. Steel, and Bechtel, pledged a critical amount of money to get the project off the ground, and planned quite explicitly, and with an ambition that in some way feels really distant from the current disjointed, short-sighted nature of, the current corporate elite, planned quite explicitly to make San Francisco a command post in global capitalism, poised to serve central administrative and consulting duties in the penetration of the so-called Pacific Rim of the globe. For this period, I just want to note quick historical facts, 4 of them, that should maybe inform our discussion tonight. A number of these are underscored by our panelist, Calvin Welch, in a paper he wrote a while back called The Fight to Stay, the creation of the community housing movement in San Francisco from 1968 to 1978. 1, the first 2 decades after the Second World War witnessed the creation of a truly integrated Bay Area as a political, economic region, envisaged and enacted from above by the Bay Area Council, most fundamentally and iconically perhaps by the advent of BART, the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, right? Which incidentally is really a true modern marvel of multi-jurisdictional municipal planning. It involved a complex general obligation bond in 1962 of $792 million and approval by voters in 3 counties, Alameda, San Francisco, and San Mateo. Brad Paul can tell us how complicated and crazy that would be. 3 counties, geo bond, 1962, $1 billion, that's crazy. 2, the mechanization and modernization contracts agreed to between 1960 and 1966 by the International Longshore and Warehouse Union and the Pacific Maritime Association, which resulted in replacing hand loading and unloading of ships with containerized mechanization and resulted in the wholesale displacement of the region's shipping industry from San Francisco to Oakland. This process resulted in realities both in terms of the city's workforce and fiscal realities that witnessed the SF Bay Guardian writing in February of 1970, copy that seems right out of the political arguments over last fall's 8 Washington ballot fight, and the Waterfront Height Limit Right to Vote Act, which is a ballot initiative that's slated to be on the city and county's ballot on June 3rd. Not to mention the Giants' planned waterfront development or the America's Cup saga. And I quote, this is 1970. San Francisco's waterfront has been put on the real estate market and is now being auctioned off to giant corporations by the city and the port. Proposals for waterfront development are pouring in, unquote. Point number 3, the designation of not less than 11 so-called project areas by the breathtakingly powerful San Francisco Redevelopment Agency. A near $1 billion entity in contemporary figures with its own police force, planning division, legal department, and health and human services providers that had no mooring to any kind of oversight by the Board of Supervisors. And then the subsequent demolition of thousands of units of affordable housing in the SOMA and in the so-called Western Addition A1 and A2 project areas. 4th, final historical point, the development between 1960 and 1981 of 30 million new square feet of office space in San Francisco, even while the city's population decreased by 61,342 persons in the same period. Kind of ironic. All of which brings us to the present. The present. A moment where the median rental rate for a one-bedroom apartment, as of Zumper earlier this afternoon, is $2,813 per month. For a two-bedroom, that's $3,925 a month. Where the average listing as of the week ending April 2nd for listed homes on the market in San Francisco is $1,527,000. And where, as per a report released last week by Tenants Together and the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, 60% of Ellis Act evictions in 2013 occurred in properties where the owner had held that property for less than a year. And then 80% of them occurred in properties where the owner had held it for less than 5. So tonight, who do we have to interrogate this present? We have a pretty cool panel. We're joined by Angelica Cabande, immediately to my left, to my right.
Yay.
Woohoo! Angelica is the Organizational Director of South of Market Community Action Network, SOMCAN. SOMCAN is it's a multiracial, membership-based organization located in the SOMA that organizes families, seniors, and young people for housing and immigrant and human rights. She has 15 years of community organizing experience. We're also joined by two people to the right, Brad Paul, who I made mention of earlier. Thanks for coming, Brad. Brad is currently the Deputy Director of the Association of Bay Area Governments, and his career is really unique, I think, of our panelists. It spans philanthropy, the public sector. He's certainly the only person on our panel whose clients have ever included the likes of Forest City, the developer. And I think he has some really unique perspective to provide us tonight. We also have Don Phillips, in turn, immediately to his left. We got a lot of Causa Justa Just Cause people in the house. Causa Justa Just Cause is a Black and Latino membership-based organization that fights for housing and immigrant rights in Oakland and San Francisco. Don's co-directors of programs. And he's a co-author of the CJJC, the Causa Justa Just Cause report, Development Without Displacement, Resisting Gentrification in the Bay Area, a report that just came out this week. Copies of it are for sale here. Robbie Clark, one of Don's comrades at Causa Justa Just Cause, who's here in the audience, was on Michael Krasny this morning. It's been getting a lot of really good press. We're excited to hear Don talk about some of the findings in that report. And finally, we have the inimitable Calvin Welch. Thanks, Calvin. I just say that he was a founding member of Choo Choo, Coalition for San Francisco Neighborhoods. He's also on the board of HANC. I also need to say SOMCAN and Just Cause, members of San Francisco
That's
Rising.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so we also have two discussants tonight. And I'd really like to thank John Elberling, 40 years of activism in San Francisco, immediately to Angelica's right for coming tonight. Thank you, John. We all know John as the executive director of TODCO since 1978. That's a real tenure. And then finally, we have the Honorable Supervisor Jane Kim. Thank you for coming tonight, Jane. Before serving on the board, you guys know Jane's a civil rights attorney. She was a community organizer for 6 years at Chinatown CDC. She was president of the school board. So look, let's end with the questions. What are our panelists discussing tonight in the wake of all the history and the data I tried to spit out? The following, I'm going to state them. What is the history of San Francisco's municipal regulations on development? What does the market do? What do we know it does without such regulations? What were the conditions, political, economic, cultural, bureaucratic, that resulted in the successful passage of those regulations? And what about the present, right? Again, what are the conditions for development now, for displacement, for the link between the commercial, residential, market rate development sector on the one hand, and the rental housing market on the other? And what lessons are there in terms of strategies and tactics from past hot markets and the struggles to make them serve more than the super rich for such movements of the present? So first we'll hear from Calvin and Brad for up to about 10 minutes each. They're gonna ground us in the 70s and in the 80s. Then we'll turn things over to Angelica and Don. And finally we'll have responses from John and Supervisor Kim. And I ask that the discussants, if possible, we'll come back to this, but they pay particular attention to the housing balance legislation, which we'll get into. And also we have to make mention of this anti-speculation tax, a likely initiative ordinance that's going to be on the ballot that'll address a lot of the stuff we're talking about. So without further ado, Calvin, can you start us off?
Thank you,
Thanks.
Mario. So I'm going to be rooted in the 70s and 80s, but I'm actually here in the 21st century. And, so in a significant way, the struggle around growth controls in the 70s and 80s represented a fundamental and basic shift in politics, the politics of San Francisco. Pretty much before the freeway fight of the 60s, there was not any political organization or political objectives of dealing with development in San Francisco. If you take a look at the history of San Francisco, for example, mayors, the issue of housing, other than producing housing, was never an issue. No mayor was ever elected or diselected on a housing issue or a housing-related issue. And since Art Agnos, virtually every mayor has had to address, in one way or another, one aspect of the housing crisis. The current mayor is struggling, running as fast as he can to try to get in front of perhaps one of the most catastrophic, dramatic increases in housing costs that the city's ever seen. And to give you an idea of A, the size of the problem, and B, the puniness of the response, the mayor has decided that a $15 minimum wage is going to be a really good thing to do in San Francisco. He's created, I think the first meeting was today, a blue ribbon committee to come up with a $15 an hour minimum wage, which in the national perspective is dynamite. I mean, President Obama's running around the country pushing a $10 and what, 20-cent minimum wage, you know?
That's right.
But in a San Francisco housing context, it's laughable. A $15 minimum wage only means that the average worker, to afford the average priced apartment in San Francisco, would only have to work the first 130 hours in the month at $15 an hour to afford the average rent in San Francisco. So the notion that we're somehow going to balance 50,000 tech workers driving up housing costs by a $15 minimum wage does not hardly compute. So we need much more, and we first recognized this in San Francisco's politics in the 70s and 80s in trying to grasp the impact of the creation of the Pacific Rim Theater, of the basic headquarters city of the Pacific Rim, which meant moving San Francisco away from light industrial and port and maritime related uses into commercial office buildings. And as Mario has said, in a decade, we added 30 million feet of commercial office space and no housing. Spur, who is now build, build, build housing, was then forget housing, build, build, build commercial. And we're supposed to forget all that. In point of fact, San Francisco blew out a jobs housing balance for the entire region. That is to say, in that decade, from the 70s and 80s, built more commercial office space, created more jobs here in San Francisco than the entire housing capacity of San Francisco to house that new workforce. And we, in fact, took the surplus housing capacity of suburban counties in order to house that workforce, creating incredible regional demands for transit that BART never really met, and totally changed the environment of the Bay Area. There was a response in San Francisco because what that meant was the first true spike, dramatic spike in housing costs and waves of demolition and housing speculation. So when housing balance gets out of whack, two things immediately happen. Prices rise and speculators start swimming the shoals of San Francisco's housing market. Happens every time, and it's always a surprise to public officials that this happens. And it's happened at least 3 times in my lifetime. The relationship between tall buildings and high housing prices was not automatic. And indeed, for many people, they still don't quite comprehend the relationship between workforce development becoming the job center of the Bay Area and the dramatic spike in housing costs that occurred. And so the folks who fought those battles started out basically opposing, almost for aesthetic reasons, tall buildings. And the notion was the way in which you control all of the bad things that happen, the term at the time was Manhattanization of San Francisco, was by not allowing a building over 75 feet. Elegantly simple and somewhat brain dead. Nonetheless, that was the first 2 efforts. In the entire battle for the freeway fight, understand this, nobody went to the ballot. The freeways were never put on the ballot in San Francisco. They were dealt through elections of supervisors. And they were finally defeated by a vote of the Board of Supervisors. San Francisco became the first city in the United States to turn down federal funding for the construction of freeways. Otherwise, where I live in the Haight-Ashbury would be an on-ramp to the Golden Gate Park Freeway. That was a proposal, folks, to take the Panhandle from 19th Avenue, Golden Gate Park and the Panhandle, and build a freeway to the Embarcadero. That was defeated not by ballot measures, but by lobbying and electing supervisors. That's kind of the old-fashioned way. By the 70s and 80s, the initiative was the primary method used. And it wasn't until the passage of the Environmental Quality Act, California Environmental Quality Act, that we began to understand the relationship between development of commercial space and impacts on the built environment, transit, employment, and housing costs principally. And there was a big debate amongst folks, as there is today. Understand what is being proposed this June is a height limit. The triggering requirement for going to the ballot is how tall a building is, not what it is, not whether or not it offers jobs for San Franciscans, not whether or not it pays its way for transit. None of those questions are, it's only height. And so, what we remember, we sometimes forget, and then we forget to remember. And then we end up in situations in which linkages between development and impacts in the human environment, who works here, how we get from home to work, and how we recreate, how we afford housing, that is part of the complex linkage system between development. The big change, I'm going to step out of the 80s, is that now the principal form of development is no longer commercial development. We're not creating development that produces jobs. We're creating luxury housing. We have become basically the bedroom for the economic center of the region, which has shifted south to Silicon Valley. Now, there's an attempt to tell you that it's all coming back to San Francisco, and Twitter is unlike the dot-com boom because Twitter has a real product. That dot-com boom, they didn't have anything. That dot-com, yeah, but they didn't have a... Twitter is a real product. And if you believe that, I've got 2 bridges I'll sell you. Twitter's down 30% in its stock. And if Twitter's stock tanks, the same thing that happened in 2000 will happen in San Francisco again. There will be a tremendous abundance of high-cost rental housing that will reduce in price, and you won't be able to rent a U-Haul trailer anywhere within the Bay region because all of those people are going to go back to where they came from, which is never San Francisco. I mean, haven't we figured out we ought to produce jobs for people who already live here, and then we wouldn't have the housing crisis of bringing in 50,000 new people? The point I'm trying to make is that there are linkages between development policies and the cost of muni, the cost of housing, and the availability of employment opportunities. And the attempt on the part of Supervisor Kim to draw those linkages between now what is the principal form of economic development, of development in San Francisco, which is luxury market rate housing and affordable housing, is exactly in keeping with the long tradition in San Francisco of trying to tease out linkages and understanding the relationship between development and impacts of those developments on the survivability of neighborhoods and communities in San Francisco.
So Calvin gave us a little bit of a trajectory from battles at the board over the freeways in the 60s, right, to the growing acumen that people's movement started to have by taking things directly to the ballot. If I could, I'd ask Brad now to pick the story up. I think he has some lessons for us from some rezoning fights and so on.
Sure. I'm going to start off in the 70s, but hopefully move out of there. A time that my 10-year-old son refers to as the olden days. Just 3 facts. When I moved here, which is probably around 73, 74, you could rent an apartment. You could buy, and this lasted for a few years after I got here, you could buy a 3-unit building in the Mission for $40,000. I looked at an apartment in the lower Hayes Valley area. It was a big Victorian with a dry cleaners on the first floor and a 3-bedroom apartment on the top floor that was $12,000. You could rent a residential hotel room in SRO for $60 a month. How far we've come. And I just want to talk about, again, in linkages, there's no silver bullet. We worked, and Calvin talked about the different ballot initiatives. The first one that passed was not the first one. There were earlier efforts in the 70s, in 72 and 70.
71, 72.
71 and 72 were just height. We got involved in 79 with Prop O, which was more about linking development to the infrastructure needed to build it and to service it. And then we did it again in the early 80s, and Prop M, the final one that passed in 86, sorry. I get confused about these years. But a number of us, including John and myself, I was working as director of the North America Planning Coalition at the time, and John was working at Todco, and we realized that the answer was not just passing Prop M, but changing the zoning. To give you an example, the Tenderloin back then was zoned for 300 and 400 foot tall offices and hotels. And we'd watch them start to march in where you see now the Park 55, the Nico, and the Hilton's last edition. And there was a plan to go to the next block. It was called Union Square West. And so when we asked the city, well, can't you say no? They said, well, we can't tell them no because it's zoned for 400-foot-high offices and hotels. They would sue us if we said no. So we said, okay, we need to change the zoning. And we started a 3-year process to change the zoning to reflect what was there, to reduce the heights to 80 feet, which was 20 feet more than the average in the Tenderloin, and to not allow commercial above the ground floor. And it took a while to pass that, but we did, and we created a large coalition to do that. And John did the same thing in the South of Market, and CCDC led an effort to do the same thing in Chinatown. And it happened, 86 was when Prop M passed. We got the zonings adopted in 87, 88, 89, and 90, that period. But the two worked together, and we formed a coalition. It was actually called the Ring Coalition, which was the neighborhoods that ring the downtown at that time, because it was just the financial district, because it was the pressure coming from there to build more office buildings and hotels that threatened us all with displacement. So we worked together, we shared information, and the other point I wanted to make is how important it is to get good help. The technical term is technical assistance. But it's really, getting the planners, the architects, and the lawyers on our side who were just as good as the architects, planners, and lawyers on the other side to help us. So we had Asian Neighbor Design working on our plan for our zoning. And they did these amazing drawings of what the neighborhood would look like if the cities, they countered with something much bigger than what we wanted. We just drew it. And we showed it to people. They went, that's crazy. And we also went to someplace called the Environmental Simulation Lab in Berkeley. And the developers, as you've all seen these, they do these pictures of 30 and 40-story buildings, but the rendering is from about a half a mile above. So you're looking down on the roof garden on the 40th floor, and you see all the green on the roofs. So these guys, the ESL people, would do cardboard models of the buildings and then drop them into the real street. So it would show you at the corner of Turk and Taylor what this huge Union Square would look like. It was 17 stories, 28 stories, and 32 stories on one block. And when people saw it, what it would actually look like, they were horrified. And when we showed it to the Planning Commission, it was the first major development that the Feinstein-appointed Planning Commission actually turned down. And we proposed, it was 1,200,000 square feet. We proposed a 500,000 square foot alternative that fit within our 80-foot height limit. And we had Asian neighborhood design and some really good architects helping us design that and come up with some really great visuals. The other thing that we learned in that fight was the importance of building coalitions, and particularly coalitions that people don't expect. The board has changed a lot in recent years, but back in those days, the members of the Board of Supervisors would just sit there and read their newspapers when we had hearings. And they would see us show up, and they'd seen us so many times. But there's somebody, a few of you may remember, named Joe Lacey, who is a real activist in the housing community. The first time I met Joe was on some legislation to stop condo conversions, I believe. And he's sitting in the back of the room, he's this great big Irish builder. And we expected him to get up there and say, we can't stop development. This is going to cost jobs. And Joe gave the most eloquent speech for saving affordable housing that I'd heard in a long time. And he was on our side. And when he spoke, they all put their newspapers down because he wasn't saying what they expected. On my board, I had a Wells Fargo Bank vice president and one of the partners of Skidmore, Owings & Merrill on the North American Planning Coalition board. And George, the Wells Fargo Bank vice president, I first met at a hearing on legislation to stop the conversion of residential hotels to tourist hotels. And he gets up there, and he looks like he's in a three-piece suit, he's a banker, and everybody expects him to rail against this outrage against the free market system. And he gave the most detailed explanation of why SROs are critical to the well-being of the city that I'd heard from anybody outside of advocates. And I found out, this is before I joined the Planning Coalition, he was on the board, and he knew all this stuff. But you could hear a pin drop when this guy started advocating, having the same position as Ted Gullickson and all the housing advocates. People went, well, what's going on here? So I think as we go forward, we have to think about there are people out there who are on our side that we don't expect, and they get a lot of attention. And so I think we have to look at building the biggest coalitions we can, and part of it is how we frame it. When we were passing the zoning in the Tenderloin, we got the usual suspects, all of our friends. We also got a few people on my board that nobody expected, like one of the partners in SOM and the head of, or vice president of Wells Fargo Bank. But we went to Spur, the Chamber of Commerce, and the previous mentioned Bay Area Council. And the developers in our neighborhood were saying this is a huge downzone. It'll turn the Tenderloin into the South Bronx, which back then was the model of what you didn't want to be because of all the disinvestment. And we said, no, it's a residential upzoning. The people that work at the Hilton need to live a few blocks away so they can walk to work. If you turn this whole neighborhood into luxury condos, which is what they were talking about back in the 80s, all your workers are going to live in Vallejo and Antioch, and when somebody doesn't report for work and you need a bartender or a person to do work in the kitchen, they're going to have to commute in from 2 hours away. Would you want that, or would you rather have somebody that lives a block away that'll say, I'll be there in 10 minutes. Let me just, change. And we actually, with very few concessions, one they thought was going to help them that backfired, we got the Chamber of Commerce, Spur, and the Bay Area Council to support the rezoning of the Tenderloin the way we wanted it. And it was just, I think, how we framed it. And I think we forget that in many cases, we have the best economic arguments on our side. The other side distorts it, and I'll give you one last example. During the Prop, and John will remember this, and Calvin as well, I think, during the first Prop O campaign to control heights in '79, the Chamber got scared because we were saying, look, these things are not paying their fair share. We're building 2-3 million square feet a year. We're bringing in 4, 8, 10,000 workers. Where's the immunity? Where's the housing? So they did a study, they commissioned a study that said that offices downtown paid more than twice what they cost the city. More than twice. End of discussion. I went to the press conference. They had 5 different consultants. They each talked about what would happen if development went on at this pace for much longer. The transit guy said, BART will break down. You'll have to build a second tube. It won't sustain this for much longer at 3 million square feet a year. There was another guy who said housing prices will go crazy. So finally, somebody in the back from KQED said, I'm reading the summary of this, and it says that high-rises are good for this. How come I'm not hearing this from your panelists? And the head of the Chamber of Commerce said, well, we didn't want you to read it. It was this thick. They paid probably $150,000 for it at the time. We didn't think you could read through all this, so we had to summarize it. So their summary contradicted what was in there, but most people just read the summary. So one of our board members of SFRG, David Jones, over the weekend, he worked for the EPA, and he's pretty good with numbers. He was John's neighbor. And he looked at their methodology, and he realized they made a fatal flaw in it. Now, he could have gotten up and said, you know, this thing's bull. But what he said is he produced a press release and a report that was only 18 pages long. And he said, if I use their methodology, yes, a high-rise building pays twice as much as it costs the city. But my 3-decker in the Mission pays 1,000 times back what it costs. So either the Chamber's methodology is bullshit, or we should level the financial district and build 3-story wood frame apartment buildings, and the city will be rolling in money. One or the other has to be true. And to the Chamber's dismay, David's report got more coverage in the press than the Chamber's report did, because it made fun of their report, and it did it in a way they couldn't criticize. And if you want to know later, I can tell you what the fatal flaw was. But I think we can be creative. We can use economics in our arguments as well, or better than the other side. And I think we can build some really interesting coalitions going forward. I'll stop there.
Much obliged, Brad. We're going to go a little more specific now. Angelica is going to take us to District 6.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. So hi, while we're working on the technical stuff, you know, SAMCAN was established in 2000 during the dot-com boom that's happening in the Southam market and in the Mission, right? A lot of you are very familiar with that. So, you know, SAMCAN, we educate, organize, and mobilize primarily with immigrant Filipino and Latino residents, not just in the Southam market, but also in the Tenderloin and in our Mission, because they're the most vulnerable and the most, in terms for us, they're the ones that doesn't always know what's going on and their rights, and they're, majority of the time, they don't even know that City Hall, they could go down, it's down the street from them. They could actually go there and talk, express, and provide input to the community planning that's happening in their neighborhood. So, you know, for SOMA, for District 6, we have, you know, there's a lot of talk about the tale of two cities, right? People have heard about that. The tale of two cities has been actually occurring in the Southam market for decades. On one side, we have the low-income, people of color, working-class communities that's working in the hotels, in the downtown area. And then on the other side of Southam market, you actually have Moscone, right, Metreon, Westfield, the downtown that's really pushing to Manhattanize the Southam Market neighborhood, or District 6 in general. And this idea didn't just occur last week or a few decades ago. It's been thought of Manhattanizing the downtown area since the 50s or maybe longer. So one of the things we're seeing in the SOMA alone is our area is actually broken down into 13 area plans, meaning one neighborhood has 13 different zoning areas and different community planning. How in the world anybody is going to be able to keep up and be able to participate in the daily things that's happening in the community? You have Yerba Buena zoning area, you have the Central Market and Tenderloin Mid-Market area. You have the West Soma, Eastern Neighborhood, Trans-Bay. All those things takes a lot of time and energy to participate. There's no way that anybody, I can't even keep up with that myself, right? So it's really challenging for residents to participate. And one of the things that SOMCAN has been doing is really getting those folks together and really understanding the different planning jargon that's going around, understanding the growth that's happening in their neighborhood, and getting feedback from the residents to actually talk about how this growth can benefit them. How is growth going to be able to ensure that the different classes in the South of Market is going to be able to sustain there? So, out of all the neighborhoods, the South of Market has the most condominiums that actually has been built, and it's still ongoing, right? We just a decade ago, over 1,000 condo development has been developed in our area. And a lot of planners, landowners, and developers are saying, let the market determine the affordable housing market, right? The more we build condominiums, the better for San Francisco. I've heard that in 2000, since I started with SOMCAN, and I'm sure Calvin and other folks probably heard that longer. And it's nothing new, it's the same mentality that as long as we're building condominiums, it's gonna provide us affordable housing. But do you think that's real? No, right? So there was I don't know if you guys ever heard of Paragon Real Estate Group. In April 2013, they said, more condos sale in the South of Market, South Beach, Yerba Buena, and Mission Bay neighborhoods than any place in San Francisco. This is where by far the greatest number of new condos have been built since the 1990s. The market here has been heating up very rapidly. Buyer demand, prices, and luxury condo sales had been increasing rapidly in 2012 and continue to do so. So just in the end of 2012, the average condos were selling around 800,000 or 850. By May 2013, it was around 929,000. So we could see the increase of capitalists and the money that they're generating in the neighborhood. So, this notion of more condos equals more affordable housing, do you think that's really true? No, right? So in the back of, there was a handout for you guys. It says residential pipeline. This is due to the housing dashboard that Supervisor Christina Olagi actually made sure is passed last year. This shows that last year alone, there was, 2013, there's about 31,000 units that's being built or in the pipeline to be built. 12,000 of that is above moderate income, and less than 7,000 is the moderate income, and 12,000 is low income, 80% AMI and below. I don't know about you guys, there's still debate about if 80% AMI is actually affordable. I can't get there. I can't get in those. But it just shows that over almost 200% of condominiums are being built in San Francisco, but yet we're only halfway or maybe halfway to actually get to our affordable housing. And so that notion of more condos being built will equal more affordable housing is no longer true, and we have actual data. Yay! So the question is growth for whom? Because definitely we're not against growth. I mean, as long as growth will incorporate the working class, people of color, low-income immigrants, as long as there's growth that incorporates us, we definitely are open to it. But we're not seeing that, right? We're not seeing that there's a balance in the growth of San Francisco. So for SOMCAN, it's really important that we find actual tools to actually balance the growth in in San Francisco. You know, the Environmental Impact Report and CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, is not enough to actually make sure that development in our communities will incorporate the different the existing residents. We actually need different tools to actually make sure that the planning department is doing its job. And if they're not going to do it, then we need to provide that for them. So that's why the Housing Balance Act is one of the tools that SOMCAN, along with Supervisor Kim and the different organization and SOMA in the city, is looking at to make sure that we're able to have a conditional use on any development that's happening in the neighborhood. And it's actually, the summary is on the other side of the residential pipeline. I will leave that to John Elberling to walk you through the housing balance. He explains it better than me. But definitely we know that the housing balance is not the silver bullet on what's going on in the housing crisis in San Francisco, but we see it as one stepping stone to actually have more community control on what's going on in our neighborhood. Thank you.
Right on. Thanks, Angelica. If we could have our panelists come back up, please.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, so from specificity of one sort, we're gonna, I think, move out a little bit. Before Don starts talking, I want to let you rock. I just want to say that this report that came out this week is a major theoretical and policy intervention. Look, it has a comprehensive definition of gentrification. It makes empirical claims about how gentrification harms working class people of color. It enumerates which neighborhoods and actually provides like a graph, a scale of which of neighborhoods are at risk for gentrification. And it elucidates a number of different policy options that municipal governments can pursue. So this is the real deal. Don?
Great. Thank you, Mario. Thank you, everyone. So I don't want to talk about any of that tonight. Peter and Mario and Calvin were like, okay, we're going to talk about policies, hardcore, and all that kind of stuff. And I was like, you know what? This is urban idea. And I've also been talking about everything that Mario mentioned too for like the last couple of months. I'm like, I never thought I would say it, but I'm tired of gentrification. We need to do something about it. I'm almost tired about talking about it. But so tonight, I want to kind of switch it up a little bit. And you know, I'm sitting among experts, so the folks at the table can tell you anything at all that you possibly could ever want to know about what kinds of local regulation should look like, need to look like in the San Francisco context in order for us to kind of start to really kind of regulate and push back on kind of this financialization, global capital, et cetera, and the way, the hot market, all this stuff. I want to talk about something a little bit different, which I think is actually really important, that is alluded to in our report, though it is the most underdeveloped part of our report. So let me talk about the thing that I know the least about tonight. So as it's been said here tonight, the forces that are causing the kind of local housing and development crisis absolutely has to be regulated at the local level, right? We can't just, whether it's Twitter, whether it's transit-oriented development, whether it's luxury condos, no matter what it is not acceptable, and none of us are going to stand for these forces, these actors just coming into the city, coming into our neighborhoods, and doing as they will, right? And it is necessary that we do everything we can, everything in our power, from Prop M to the housing balance, anti-speculation tax, et cetera, to actually think really hard and well, which is what my colleagues here have done, and many people in the audience who I'm seeing, to really think about how do do we regulate, and what can we regulate at the local level, and how do we impose the strongest regulations possible, right? We will not concede our neighborhoods and our city to these forces. But I'm looking in the audience as well, and I think that this is a safe statement to make, because UrbanIDEA is the left space, so I'm going to say some stuff, right? So I'm gonna just say, and then you nod. If you're down, the harder you nod, the more I'll be like, you're more or less down with what I'm saying. But can we agree that local regulation of global forces, of transnational forces, of a transnational system is not enough? And that we can do really, really strong and powerful work and have strong and powerful impact, as has been talked about, and that we will still run up against a limitation of inherently being able to only apply local regulations to forces and systems that are essentially global and transnational in nature. Okay. That's right. Interrupt me. Feel free to interrupt me, especially if it's like that, okay? So this is something that we've actually, and when I say we, I mean in our organization at Causa Justa, we've been thinking about this and talking about this more and more over the last couple of years. Like a lot of the colleagues here on the panel, you know, we have had some successes, many failures, but we have had some successes, right? We have been able to push some of the types of local regulations that we think are important. We've worked with other people. Together, we've made headway. And then, you know, we are still more and more left with this question of like, but really, where is all this headed? And really, what are the types of changes that we want to see? And can we do that through local legislation alone? And more, the answer for us is that there needs to be a way to rethink, specifically to develop a left approach to how we think about the local fights and our local campaigns, and to think about it in an explicitly left way that begins to allow us to push beyond just the paradigm of regulation and local campaign. Right? And I think this we actually also share with many people in the room. I don't think this is a unique unique idea to the work that we do at Causa Justa, right? But we have been trying to grapple with this much more systematically. So what does that look like, right? So regardless of the nature of the fight, I think that there are a few things that we need to start to think about when we develop kind of our matrix or our approach. I think Brad kind of alluded to this, like when we measure our strategy and we begin to map out what it is that we're trying to do. So I think there's some of the concrete things that we can be thinking about for this kind of approach that I'm trying to name. So I think one is that we need to think about how our campaigns and our fights, the local work, actually begins to build a new type of consciousness, right? And the new type of consciousness has to come with and from and by the people who we are engaging in these fights. So first and foremost, you know, and I just realized I should have said this more explicitly, and other folks have talked about this, you know, so in our work, we think that, and you can ask me more why later, but we think that, you know, working class communities of color have to lead a lot of these efforts. Even on the local fights, all these local fights that we're talking about, these are the folks who are centrally impacted, both by the issue that the policies are trying to address, and then the policies once they are passed. That's for whom and with whom the policies really speak to. So we need to build new consciousness, right? We need to actually say, in our campaigns, in our local fights, we need to kind of build the capacity and appetite where people start to do things like question the notion of private ownership of property, for example, right? Where people say, is it logical that we rely on private landlords to provide housing for the vast majority of people? Is it logical? I don't know, right? We need to open the space and we need to provide the ability for people to question things that are on the surface the way things work and logical. So we rely on private capital to drive development in our cities. Our city planning is not done by the city. It is done by the developer who shows up and says, I want to make or build or do this here. And then the folks in the city run around and help make that possible. That's planning, right? So we have to create opportunity for new consciousness. We have to give people the chance to ask the question, is what is happening in my neighborhood, on my block, in my building, does that make sense? That's what our organizing needs to do. We need to give people enough time, space, and capacity to ask that kind of a question. Does it make sense that the bosses own and we do the work? I don't know, right? Then through the fights, we need to build militancy, right? So our people need to be able to go from, people need to be able to go from, I'm willing to stand up to my landlord or my boss, to I'm willing to take over my workplace or this piece of property, to I'm willing to actually go and shut down city, right? We gotta build it over time, so militancy, right? I don't have much more time, I'll just quickly run through the other ones. I mean, we need to build new vision. I do want to talk about this for 1 minute. It's like, here's the thing, it's like most of us, I include myself and the organization I work with in this analysis, most of us, because of what we live within and under, unfortunately have a tremendously narrow vision. We are very limited in what it is that we envision or are capable of envisioning of how things need and should change. If we are going to push back on these global and transnational systems, we need to have new vision. We need to be able to say, what would a new workplace look like? What would a healthy and sustainable and truly safe neighborhood look like for me? What does my city need to look like? We actually have to do that together. I do this exercise myself at home at night before I go to bed. I say, go. 3 things. What would you like to see? I have a shockingly hard time doing it in a meaningful way. I have so few examples. I know so little about how to think of a world and neighborhoods and a city beyond what it is that I'm presented with. I think that's true for most of us, right? And so our work together has to provide us, help all of us build that muscle, build vision, start to be able to say, well, what would non-commodified housing look like on a scale that's not 3 land-trusted homes or 5 land-trusted homes, but really how do we think of large-scale community shared housing, community-controlled housing, shared workplaces, etc. So all this to say that we need to bring together strong policy fights with strong left organizing. And we need to do this in a real way so that the left organizing doesn't feel like some kind of intellectual, ideological, agitational exercise, right? So that means the meetings, the mobilizations, the actions, the campaigns. We need to make sure people most impacted are sitting at the table. We need to make sure that they are, we're not just bringing them for stories. That actually the folks who are being impacted are actually experts, right? They know what's happening, they know it intuitively, they know it in their bodies. So we're gonna centralize the expertise, and then we're gonna actually take the leadership. So sometimes that means when there are 13 area plans, we might need to slow down planning or slow down a meeting so that folks who are just coming to hear about something for the first time actually get a chance to meaningfully participate, meaningfully engage, and then actually make a decision.